The room was small, dim, and painfully quiet. Amina sat on the edge of her bed, her feet barely touching the cold floor. The walls around her were stained with age, cracked like they had grown tired of holding themselves together. A single bulb flickered above, casting weak shadows that moved every time she breathed. In her right hand she held an old watch. It wasn't shiny. The leather strap was worn thin, softened by years of use. The glass face carried tiny scratches, each one marking a moment that had already passed. Still it worked. The second hand moved slowly, faithfully, as if it had no idea how broken everything else had become. This watch had belonged to her father. It was the last thing she had left of him. Amina's fingers tightened around it. The ticking sound filled the room, loud in the silence. Each tick felt like a reminder, time was moving forward whether she was ready or not. Outside her door, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Heavy. Angry. She recognized them instantly. The landlord had been coming more often lately. First with polite warnings, then sharp words, and now with silence that carried threats. Earlier that day he had slipped a paper under her door. She hadn't picked it up yet. She didn't need to read it to know what it said. Pay or leave. Her stomach growled softly. She ignored it like she had learned to do. Hunger had become familiar, almost normal. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten a full meal without counting every bite. The room felt colder than before. Amina looked around as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The empty shelf where her father's books once stood. The chair he used to sit on every evening, now pushed into a corner like it didn't belong anymore. The silence he left behind was heavier than his absence. Her chest tightened. Since her father died, the world had become louder and crueler. People moved fast, spoke fast, demanded fast answers. No one waited. No one cared that her heart was still learning how to beat without him. She lowered her gaze to the watch again. Her father used to wear it every day. No matter how hard life became, it stayed on his wrist. He checked it before leaving for work. He touched it when he was thinking. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he smiled at it softly, like it carried a secret only he understood. Amina pressed the watch against her palm. It still felt warm somehow. Or maybe that was just her memory filling the space. A sudden knock slammed against the door. Her body stiffened. Amina, a voice called from outside. You can't hide forever. She didn't answer. Her throat felt tight like it had closed itself off from the world. The footsteps lingered, then finally moved away. When the hallway fell silent again, Amina let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. She had cried enough these past months. Crying hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't brought her father back. It hadn't paid the rent or filled her stomach. Slowly she stood up. The watch lay heavy in her hand now, heavier than before. It felt like more than metal. Like a promise. Like a responsibility she was failing to protect. She walked to the small table near the door and placed the watch on it. The sound it made was soft, but it echoed inside her chest. Amina stared at it for a long moment. Fear crept in quietly. Doubt followed close behind. She knew she was standing at the edge of something she could not undo once she stepped forward. Her hand hovered in the air. Time kept ticking. And she had never felt so unsure of what came next. The watch had always been more than an object. Amina remembered sitting beside her father on the worn wooden steps outside their small home. She was small then, her legs dangling as she leaned against his side. The sun would warm their shoulders and the world felt safe. The only sound that mattered was the steady ticking of the watch on his wrist. She pressed her ear against it once, just to hear it. Tick, tick, tick. Each pulse felt like a heartbeat, steady, patient, unyielding. Her father noticed, of course. He smiled, that quiet, gentle smile he always reserved for her. Time moves forward, he said softly. Always forward. Even then she didn't fully understand what he meant. She only knew that when he was near, nothing could hurt her. He had this way of making life feel safe even when it wasn't. He was a hard man but kind. His hands were rough from labor, calloused and scarred, yet they held her gently. He had never had much, but he gave everything he could. His clothes were simple, patched in places, but always neat. Even on days when the cupboard was empty, he made sure she had something to eat first. The watch had belonged to his father before him. He told Amina once that it wasn't just a watch, it was a reminder. A reminder that life was fragile, that moments passed, and that the way you spent them mattered more than what you owned. Amina remembered one rainy evening. They sat together by the window, listening to water splatter against the tin roof. She had asked why he never sold the watch even when money was tight. He looked down at it and smiled, eyes soft but resolute. "Money comes and goes," he said. "But time never returns." She had nodded, pretending to understand, though the weight of his words was too much for her young mind. Later, when she was older, she realized he had been teaching her something far bigger than the ticking seconds. He had been teaching her about patience, about resilience, about living without surrendering dignity. Even in the hardest moments, he never let despair take him. When work was scarce, he walked farther, tried harder, smiled wider. Every struggle was met with quiet determination. And always, the watch stayed on his wrist. After her mother died, he became everything she had left. She remembered the nights when he would sit by the dim light of the kitchen, tracing the watch's face with his finger, staring at it like he was talking to someone beyond the walls of the room. He never complained. He just endured, quietly, firmly. To Amina, the watch was him. Every tick, every scratch, every worn edge, it was a piece of his heart, of his life, of the love he had poured into her. It wasn't just a watch. It was memory, safety, sacrifice. Now, sitting alone in her small, dim room, she realized the full weight of it. Selling the watch would not just be giving up a piece of metal. It would be letting go of the man who had shaped her life. It would feel like erasing him bit by bit. She traced the edges with trembling fingers. She could almost feel his hand there, guiding her, steadying her. She could almost hear him whisper, "Time moves forward. Always forward." Her chest tightened. She missed him more than words could carry. And yet, in the quiet shadow of her room, surrounded by empty walls and creeping hunger, she knew that the watch might be the only thing standing between her and survival. Her fingers lingered over it, unwilling to let go but knowing that soon she would have no choice. The weight of memory pressed down on her shoulders, and she felt the first flicker of fear that she might betray him, not out of desire but out of need. It was more than a decision. It was a fracture in her heart, a step into a future she could not predict. Time ticked on. And with every tick she felt the distance growing, between the past she clung to, and the present she could not ignore. The knock at the door came again. Louder this time, sharp and impatient. "Amina, open up. You can't hide forever." Her stomach lurched. Her fingers froze on the worn edge of the table. The watch, her last connection to her father, rested there, small, fragile, and unbearably heavy. She didn't move. She couldn't. The landlord's footsteps echoed down the hallway. They were angry, deliberate. Every stomp reminded her that time was running out, that the world was moving without her, that the little she had left was slipping further from her grasp. Her chest tightened and her throat burned. She pressed her hand against it, trying to calm herself, but the hunger in her belly twisted like fire. She hadn't eaten properly in days. Bread, a few coins, some water, that was all that stood between her and exhaustion. Even her pride began to waver. She had promised herself she would never give up the watch. Not for money. Not for survival. Yet here she was, trembling, considering the impossible. Amina sank to the floor, her back against the wall. She stared at the peeling paint and cracked tiles, the dull shadows that stretched across the room like they were swallowing her whole. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Time moves forward. Always forward. She wondered if he had ever felt this way, helpless, trapped, broken. The thought made her chest ache. A draft slipped under the door, carrying the smell of the street, wet asphalt, smoke, and the distant hum of cars. Life outside was alive, moving, cruelly indifferent. And inside she was stuck, suffocating in grief and need. Bills lay scattered across the floor. Rent overdue. Medical notices. Threats. She had no money, no food, no options left that felt right. Her gaze returned to the watch. It gleamed faintly under the weak bulb, worn but unyielding, a constant in a life that had become anything but. She lifted it into her hand, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of her father's life, his sacrifices, his endless patience. And yet, the world outside demanded action. Hunger, debt, eviction, they did not wait for memories. She thought of the little market shop a few blocks away. The man there would buy it, he always did. He didn't care about the story, about the hands that had worn it, about the father who had left it behind. He cared only about the price, the metal, the leather. The thought twisted her stomach. Selling it would feel like betrayal, like giving away a piece of her soul. And still, her body ached, her stomach roared, her heart whispered for survival. She stood slowly, legs trembling, back pressed to the wall. The watch pressed against her palm felt heavier than ever, like it carried her father's eyes, his hands, his voice. Each step toward the door made her feel smaller, weaker, more ashamed. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. One small movement and everything would change. Outside, footsteps stopped. Silence. The world waited. Amina pressed the watch against her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to memorize the feel of it, the weight of her father's love, the ticking heartbeat of a life that had given her everything. She opened her eyes and stepped forward. The hallway stretched before her, narrow and dim, but it led somewhere. Somewhere she did not know. Somewhere she could not turn back from. Every breath felt loud. Every heartbeat was a drum of warning. She was leaving behind more than a room, more than a memory. She was leaving behind a piece of herself. And yet, survival demanded it. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Light from the street spilled into the dark room, weak and uneven. Amina's hand tightened around the watch, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Then it moved again, indifferent, relentless, unstoppable. Her decision had been made. The first step had been taken. And there was no turning back. The city smelled of smoke and dust as Amina stepped onto the crowded street. Her coat clung to her thin frame, and the worn shoes made her feet ache with every step. The world moved fast around her, vendors shouting, children laughing, cars honking. Yet she felt like she was walking underwater, detached from all of it. In her pocket, the watch rested against her palm. Cold, solid, unyielding. Yet it felt heavy, not in weight but in meaning. Every step toward the little shop that bought old items pressed on her chest like stones. She paused outside the door. The glass window reflected her pale face, her hollow eyes, her trembling hands. The watch glinted in the morning sun. She remembered her father smiling at it, tracing its worn edges, whispering that time always moves forward. A shiver ran down her spine. Inside the shop the air was stale. The walls were lined with shelves crowded with metal and leather, watches, clocks, trinkets, things with no stories and things whose stories no one cared about. The man behind the counter glanced at her, eyes sharp and indifferent. "Looking to sell?" he asked, not really looking. Amina swallowed hard. She nodded. Her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to say something, to explain, to tell him this watch had been her father's, that it was the last piece of him she had. But no words came. The stories didn't matter here. Only the price did. She placed the watch on the counter. It looked small, insignificant next to the piles of metal and trinkets. But in her mind, it screamed, shouted, begged her not to leave it behind. The man picked it up, turned it over, tapped it lightly. "Good condition. Leather's worn, but the mechanism still works. We can give you," he named a number. "Not much. Enough to survive a few days. Enough to silence the landlord." Amina stared at him, at the watch, at the coins he pushed toward her. She wanted to grab the watch back. She wanted to run away with it, to hide forever in her memories. But she didn't. She took the money with trembling hands. Every coin felt like a betrayal. Every step away from the counter felt like leaving a piece of her heart behind. The watch was gone. Her father's touch, his love, the weight of his life, all gone. Outside, the world had not stopped. Vendors shouted. Children ran past. Cars honked. But Amina felt suspended in a bubble of grief. She walked slowly, clutching the coins, not wanting to look at them too closely, not wanting to remind herself of what they had cost. Her chest ached. Her hands shook. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't. Not here, not yet. The city swallowed her as she moved on, but inside, a storm raged. The watch was gone, and with it, a part of her past. She felt unmoored, like a tree ripped from its roots, drifting in a world that had no time for grief. And yet, a small, quiet voice whispered in her mind, "Time moves forward. Always forward." She didn't understand it now. Perhaps she never would. All she knew was the emptiness, the sharp, echoing loss that followed her down every street. Somewhere deep inside, though, a small seed of awareness stirred. The choice had been hers, and it had consequences. She could feel them already, like the first shiver before a storm breaks. The world carried on, indifferent. And she, Amina, was left holding the weight of what she had done, standing on the edge of something she could not yet see. The watch was gone, and everything had changed. The city outside her small apartment was dark but alive. The distant hum of cars, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint chatter of people returning home, it all felt normal. But inside, Amina felt anything but normal. The coins in her pocket felt cold, heavy, meaningless. The watch was gone, taken by someone who didn't care, someone who would never know or understand its weight. And yet, something strange began to stir, something she couldn't name. She sank onto her bed, exhaustion pressing her down. Her stomach was empty, her limbs ached, but it wasn't just physical fatigue that weighed on her, it was the sense that something had shifted. Something unseen had been set in motion the moment she let the watch go. At first it was subtle. A flicker of light across the room, as if the weak bulb above had danced in a rhythm all its own. Then came the sound, soft, almost imperceptible like the ticking of a clock, but different. The ticking came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing against the walls, growing louder with each passing second. Amina's heart raced. She sat up, eyes wide, scanning the shadows that twisted and writhed in the corners of the room. The familiar silence of her home had turned alien, threatening. A cold draft swept across her skin, though all windows were closed. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering. The air smelled faintly metallic, like iron, like blood. She clutched at the coins in her pocket as if they could anchor her to reality. Then she saw it. A movement in the corner of her room, faint at first, almost like a trick of the shadows. But it solidified, a fleeting glimpse of something small and round, gleaming faintly in the darkness. She froze. The shape was familiar. Her father's watch. But how? It had been sold. She had held it in her hands that afternoon and then handed it over. The shop. The man. It was gone. And yet there it was, glinting softly from the corner of the room, impossible yet undeniably real. Fear took her breath away. Her fingers shook as she reached toward it, and the moment she touched the space where it should have been, it vanished. A whisper brushed her ear. So soft she barely heard it. Time moves forward. Always forward. Her eyes darted around the room. No one was there. Her heart pounded. She fell back against the bed, trembling, trying to understand what was happening. Her mind raced. Exhaustion, hunger, grief. Was it a hallucination? A dream? Then came the knocking. Not at the door this time. Not outside. Inside. Soft, deliberate, like someone, or something, was rapping against her walls. She pressed herself against the far corner, breath caught in her throat. Every shadow seemed alive now. Every flicker of the bulb stretched into shapes, distorted figures that loomed just out of reach. The ticking grew louder, overwhelming, drowning out her thoughts. And then a memory struck her with sudden clarity. Her father, staring at the watch, whispering stories she had barely understood. The sacrifices he had made. The lessons he had tried to teach her about time, about choices, about responsibility. The weight of that memory collided with her fear. The watch wasn't just an object. It was a thread connecting her to everything she had lost, and to everything she had the power to change. Amina's knees drew to her chest. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The room seemed to shrink around her, the shadows pressing closer. She pressed her eyes shut, willing herself to breathe, willing herself to be brave. Time had shifted. Something ancient, something that didn't obey logic, had been awakened the moment she let the watch go. And she now knew with a gut-deep certainty that nothing would ever be the same. Outside, the city continued, unaware, uncaring. Inside, Amina sat alone, trembling, her mind spinning. The watch had returned, but not in the way she expected. It had returned as a reminder of her father, of the choices she had made, of the weight of every second she had left. And in that moment, standing at the edge of fear and revelation, she understood the truth she had been avoiding. The night she sold the watch was not the night her past ended. It was the night her life began to unravel, and a storm of consequences, both terrifying and profound, was about to descend. Her heartbeat slowed, but her fear did not. She pressed her face to her knees and whispered, almost to herself, almost in defiance, "What have I done?" The room waited, silent, except for the ticking, an impossible, echoing, relentless ticking that promised change. And Amina knew, nothing, not even time itself, would ever forgive her the way she had just forgiven herself. The morning came quietly, almost gently, but it brought no peace. Amina woke to the faint gray light slipping through her curtains, her body stiff from a night spent half awake, half paralyzed by fear. Her hands instinctively reached for her pocket. Empty. The coins she had taken from selling the watch were gone. The watch itself, gone too. Not back in her room, not on her table. Just gone like it had never existed at all. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of what had happened. She told herself it had been a dream. Exhaustion, grief, stress, the mind played tricks. But deep inside, a cold, sharp part of her knew it had not been a dream. The flickering light, the shadows, the ticking, the whisper, time moves forward. Always forward. They were real. She sat on the edge of her bed, knees drawn up, trying to ground herself in the ordinary. But the ordinary had shifted. Every sound, every flicker of light, every shadow felt alive, like the world had changed overnight. Days passed, though time felt fractured. She moved through them mechanically, attending to the basics: food, water, rent notices, bills. But the night had left a residue in her mind, an echo she could not shake. The world felt fragile, precarious. Every decision felt weighted. Every choice carried consequences far beyond what she could see. She began noticing things she hadn't before. Small moments, subtle signs, her father's words repeating in her mind in ways she hadn't understood, objects around the apartment taking on new significance. The watch had not been just a possession. It had been a legacy, a guide, a moral compass. And now that legacy had left her with a reckoning she wasn't prepared for. Guilt took root in her chest. She felt it with every breath, every step, every thought. Guilt for selling the watch. Guilt for betraying her father's memory. Guilt for thinking of herself first, even when survival demanded it. She realized that what she had given away wasn't just metal and leather. It was time, it was memory, it was trust. And she had traded it for fleeting security. Amina began seeing her father differently now, in ways she hadn't allowed before. She remembered his strength, his patience, his sacrifices. He had faced hardship without giving in to despair. He had endured hunger, cold, poverty, loneliness, and had done so with dignity. He had given her everything he could, and she had faltered. The realization struck her hard. She could not undo it. She could not bring the watch back, could not hold her father's hand again, could not reclaim the past. Yet the consequences extended beyond guilt. Strange occurrences continued, subtle at first, like the faint sound of ticking where no clock existed, shadows that moved in impossible ways, the sense of being watched, but not by anything human. She began to understand that the watch had carried power beyond sentiment. It had been a tether, a guide, a reminder of moral and spiritual truths her father had lived by. Now, untethered, that power seemed restless, searching. Amina's worldview began to crack. The life she had taken for granted, the ordinary rules she had obeyed, no longer applied. Time, memory, and responsibility, these were no longer abstract concepts. They were living, urgent, relentless. And she had to face them. She thought of the man at the shop, indifferent, cold, unconcerned with the weight of history she had handed him. She thought of the coins that now seemed meaningless, worthless, shallow compared to what had been lost. She felt the emptiness of survival without guidance, without meaning, without legacy. And in the midst of the fear, guilt, and confusion, a quiet, insistent truth began to surface. Her father's watch had never been just about time. It had been about choices, about integrity, about carrying forward what mattered even when the world pressed down hard. Amina's chest ached, her head spun, but the awareness settled deep inside her. She had survived the night. She had faced fear she could barely name. But survival alone was not enough. She needed understanding. She needed to reconcile her guilt, to search for truth, and to honor what had been entrusted to her, even if it was gone. The world outside carried on, indifferent. But inside, Amina's life had been irreversibly changed. The night had left her raw, trembling, and alone, but also awake. Awake to the magnitude of choices, the weight of memory, and the cost of betrayal. She pressed her palms to her eyes and whispered, almost to herself, almost in defiance, "I will not waste what he gave me. I have to understand. I have to know." And with that, a new determination began to stir, a fragile, uncertain determination, but one that carried the first glimmer of hope. The aftermath was not gentle. It was not kind. It was painful, relentless, and unforgiving. But it had revealed something she could no longer ignore. The watch had left, but its lessons remained. And now she had to find them. The days after that night blurred into each other. Amina moved through the city like a shadow, her body present, but her mind elsewhere. She avoided the sun, the noise, the chatter of people who didn't know what she carried inside. Every familiar street, every corner of the market, every sound reminded her of the watch, its absence, its meaning, and the choices she had made. She began to search. Not for the watch. That was gone, lost to the world. She searched for understanding, for clarity, for a way to reconcile herself with the weight of her actions. She revisited the small memories of her father, replaying them as if they were scenes in a film. The way he walked to work with worn shoes, refusing to complain. The way he smiled at her with patience she could never fully repay. The way he handled hardship with quiet dignity, never letting anger or despair rule him. She realized the watch had been a symbol, yes, but not of time alone. It was a symbol of choice, of values, of how a life could be lived with integrity even when the world offered none in return. Her guilt was immense. She felt it in every step, every breath, every thought. Selling the watch had been survival, yes, but it had been survival at the cost of legacy. And she could not stop thinking of the moment her fingers had let go. That small motion, that tiny surrender, had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Amina wandered through the city streets, seeking answers from anything and anyone who might help her understand. She spoke with old neighbors who remembered her father, listened to their stories, and saw pieces of him she had never known. He had helped people quietly without reward. He had given guidance, protection, and hope to strangers, never boasting, never expecting thanks. The realization hit her hard. He had been teaching her not only through his words but through his actions. Every sacrifice he had made, every small act of love, every moment of patience. It had been a lesson, a legacy, a map to live by. And she had almost ignored it. Amina returned home each night, exhausted, but filled with a growing understanding. She could not reclaim the watch, but perhaps she could reclaim its meaning. Perhaps she could carry forward what her father had taught her, in ways that mattered more than objects, more than possessions, more than fleeting survival. She began writing down memories. Simple things, his voice, his smile, the lessons he had whispered. The way he treated time like a precious gift. The way he made choices even when it was easier not to. Each word she wrote felt like stitching herself back together, repairing the fractures inside her. The ticking of a distant clock in her apartment sounded different now. Not ominous. Not threatening, but insistent, persistent. A reminder that time did indeed move forward, and that she had a choice about how to use it. Her journey inward was painful. She confronted her guilt openly, allowing it to speak, to weigh on her, to carve lessons into her soul. She allowed herself to grieve not only for her father but for the trust she had nearly squandered. She allowed herself to understand that survival was not the ultimate lesson. Living with integrity, with courage, with remembrance, that was. And slowly, imperceptibly, Amina began to feel a shift. The city outside remained indifferent, chaotic, relentless. But inside her, a quiet strength began to emerge. She felt the pulse of her father's lessons moving through her. The watch may have been gone, but the principles it had represented, sacrifice, patience, love, integrity, were alive, waiting to be embraced. She understood now. Her father had given her more than a watch. He had given her a compass. And now she would follow it. The sun rose slowly, casting pale light through her small apartment window. For the first time in weeks, Amina felt the quiet stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. It was fragile, tentative, like the first green shoots of spring after a long winter. But it was there. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, the pages of her notebook scattered around her. Memories, lessons, small stories of her father. Each written down, each preserved, each a piece of the man she had almost lost entirely. She traced the words with her fingers, letting them sink into her mind, into her bones. It came to her slowly, then all at once. The watch had never been the gift. The watch had never been the point. What her father had left her, what he had fought to protect and teach her, was far greater than a piece of metal and leather. It was resilience. It was integrity. It was the courage to face hardship without losing herself. It was the ability to carry love forward, even when loss felt unbearable. Tears fell, silently, freely, washing away the last remnants of fear that had kept her paralyzed. She was not weak. She was not lost. She was not defined by her mistakes. She was defined by her choices, and from this moment she would choose differently. She stood, walking to the window. The city stretched before her, busy, harsh, alive. And for the first time she did not feel small in its vastness. She felt capable. She felt awake. There were decisions to make, paths to follow, responsibilities to honor. She would not reclaim the watch. That chapter had closed. But she could reclaim her life. She could reclaim her values. She could act in a way that would make her father proud, even without the object he had once carried. Her first step was small. She gathered her notebooks, her notes, the memories she had preserved, and tucked them safely into her bag. These were her new inheritance, the tangible proof of what mattered most. She would carry them with her always. Then came the forgiveness. Forgiveness for herself, for the choices she had made out of fear and desperation. Forgiveness for a world that had demanded more than it gave. Forgiveness for a past she could not change, but whose lessons she could honor. Amina breathed deeply, letting the air fill her lungs and sweep away the last traces of guilt that had weighed her down. She felt strength returning, quiet but undeniable. Strength she had inherited not from the watch, but from the man who had worn it. Stepping into the street, she felt each footfall echo differently now. Purposefully. Intentionally. The city's chaos still swirled around her, but she was no longer swept away. She walked forward, not running from the past, not clinging to it, but moving with it, carrying its lessons, carrying its truth. Time moved forward. Always forward. And now so did she. Amina smiled softly to herself, a rare, genuine smile. She felt grounded. She felt alive. She felt capable of facing whatever came next. The watch had been a guide, a symbol, a tether to a man she loved. But what he had truly left her, what had survived beyond metal and leather, was far more powerful. He had left her life. He had left her strength. He had left her courage. He had left her choice. And for the first time since his death, Amina knew that she would honor all of it. The morning air carried a soft, clean scent as Amina stepped outside. The city around her was awake, its noise and movement no longer threatening, but alive in its own rhythm. Birds chirped on the rooftops, cars hummed down the streets, and the distant chatter of neighbors drifted to her ears. Everything was ordinary, yet somehow extraordinary. She had lived through nights she would never forget, and the ordinary world felt new, like the first breath after a long illness. Her hands were empty, but they did not feel hollow. The watch, the object that had consumed her grief, her fear, her guilt, was gone, yes. But the lessons it represented were not. They pulsed inside her, a quiet rhythm she could feel in her chest with every heartbeat. Her father's legacy was no longer a tangible object. It was living, present, woven into the choices she would make, the life she would live. Amina walked slowly through the narrow streets, noticing details she had never seen before. The cracks in the sidewalks, the colorful doors of the houses, the way sunlight kissed the tops of the buildings. Every detail felt like a small miracle, a reminder that life carried on, that beauty existed even in imperfection, and that time, relentless as it was, could be a companion, not a prison. She thought back to the past months, the nights of despair, the suffocating loneliness, the fear that had nearly broken her. She remembered the knock at the door, the hunger, the eviction notices, the weight of responsibility that had pressed down on her like a stone. She remembered the night she had sold the watch, and the fear, the trembling, the sense of irreversible loss. And she remembered the night after, when the impossible had happened, when the world had shifted in ways she could not understand. Shadows had moved, whispers had spoken, and the ticking of time had seemed alive. She had felt fear like nothing else, as if the universe itself were holding her accountable. Yet she had survived. Not by reclaiming the watch, not by undoing the past, but by facing it. By confronting her choices, by allowing herself to feel the full weight of her guilt, by remembering her father not as a memory but as a guide. She had walked through the fire of grief, fear, and doubt, and she had emerged changed. Amina stopped at a small park, a patch of green in the midst of the city's gray concrete. She sat on a bench, her hands resting lightly on her knees, and let the sunlight warm her face. For a long while she said nothing. She did not need words. She did not need explanations. The quiet of the morning, the gentle rhythm of life continuing around her, spoke volumes. She thought of her father, of the man who had worn the watch with care, of the life he had led with patience, sacrifice, and integrity. She realized now that he had left her far more than a possession. He had left her the tools to navigate life, courage, resilience, love, and above all, the understanding that time itself was precious and fleeting, and that every moment carried meaning. Amina closed her eyes and let a slow, steady breath fill her lungs. She imagined her father beside her, smiling gently as he always had. She imagined him nodding at her decisions, at the life she was beginning to reclaim. And for the first time in months she felt whole, not because the past had been erased, not because grief had vanished, but because she had learned to carry it differently, with awareness, with intention, with love. The watch had been a symbol, yes, but the true gift had always been invisible. It was the principles her father had lived by, the choices he had made, and the example he had set. That inheritance had not diminished with time or loss. If anything, it had grown stronger in the wake of hardship. Amina stood, brushing dust from her clothes, and looked out over the park. Children played, laughter echoing, carefree and fleeting. Elderly men sat on benches, talking quietly about life, about love, about days long gone. Couples walked hand in hand, their steps synchronized in ways that felt timeless. And she understood. Life moved forward, relentless, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, always continuing. Her gaze softened. She could not change the past. She could not undo the nights of fear, the choices made in desperation, the moments of doubt. But she could move forward. She could act with intention. She could honor her father's lessons not by holding on to an object, but by living in a way that reflected the values he had instilled in her. Amina took a deep breath and let the warmth of the sun settle into her bones. She felt a quiet determination, a grounded strength that came not from possession or certainty, but from understanding, acceptance, and love. She had inherited more than she had realized, and she would carry it forward. She began walking again, her steps steady, her head held high. The city, vibrant and messy, welcomed her not as a lost soul but as someone reborn into her own life. The echoes of the past remained, yes, but they were no longer chains. They were guides, reminders, markers of the path she now chose to follow. Time moved forward. Always forward. And so did she. She paused at a corner, looking back at the streets she had walked countless times, feeling the weight of memory and the lightness of understanding in the same breath. She smiled softly, a quiet, lasting smile. She had been broken, afraid, and lost. But now she was more than that. Amina understood that her father's love had never been contained in a watch. It had lived in every lesson, every story, every act of courage he had shown her. And it would continue to live in her, not as an object to hold but as a life to honor. She walked on, each step deliberate, each breath steady, each heartbeat a reminder that the past had shaped her, but it did not define her. The city's chaos no longer threatened her. It moved with her, alongside her, part of the rhythm of her own time. And as she disappeared into the flow of life, Amina carried with her the most precious inheritance of all, the understanding that time moves forward, that love endures beyond loss, and that she had the strength to shape her own path, even in the face of uncertainty. The watch was gone. But the man who had worn it, and the life he had led, was with her always. And she knew finally that she would be okay.